Everyone laughed when a female mechanic inherited an old rusty hangar and called it useless junk. But when she decided to open the heavy doors, she discovered a secret about her veteran father that changed everything and silenced even the loudest mockers. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The day the lawyer called, the world felt small and heavy, like it had been pressing on Maya Rivers for years, and finally decided to drop all of its weight at once. She had been sitting at her kitchen table in a cramped apartment that always smelled faintly of motor oil and old coffee, staring at bills that never seemed to shrink, when the voice on the other end of the line said the words that pulled her back into a past she thought she had already buried. "Your father left you property, an airfield, an old hangar." The words rang hollow, almost absurd. Her father was gone now, a quiet man who had carried the air of discipline and secrecy until the end, and all he had chosen to leave her was something everyone else considered worthless. Maya had grown up in a town where names lingered on people longer than they should. Her family had always been the Rivers, the quiet black family with the serious father who never talked about his service, the mother who taught at the local school, and the daughter who spent more time in garages and scrapyards than on playgrounds. From the time she could walk, she had followed her father to the shed behind their small house, fascinated by the way he could make broken things breathe again. She remembered being 7 years old, standing on a stool just tall enough to peer into the guts of an old lawnmower as he explained how combustion worked in the simplest terms. While other kids were learning how to braid hair or play jump rope, she was learning the difference between torque and horsepower, between grease that meant life and grease that meant death. Her mother passed when Maya was still in her teens, and from then on it had been just her and her father. Walter Rivers was not an easy man. His silence could stretch into hours, and his rules about discipline and order made the house feel more like barracks than a home. But when he did speak, his words carried weight. Finish what you start. Never cut corners. Respect the machine, and it will respect you. Those were his gospel, and Maya, stubborn and sharp as she was, absorbed them even when she pretended not to. By the time she turned 18, she enlisted. It wasn't just to escape the narrow eyes of neighbors who never believed she would amount to much. It was also to prove to herself and to her father that she had inherited more than just his blood. She trained as an aviation technician, her hands quickly proving they could keep pace with the toughest mechanics in her unit. Years of service hardened her, taught her the rhythm of machines and the language of engines that scream for life in the dead of night on airstrips far from home. But a deployment injury cut her career short, and the military, as unforgiving as it was structured, sent her back to civilian life with a limp that never quite healed and a pension that barely covered rent. Civilian life was lonelier than she imagined. Jobs were scarce in her town, and what little work she found, fixing pickup trucks, tuning outdated farm equipment, never lasted. People liked her skills, but not her presence. Customers whispered about the woman mechanic with thin smiles, then took their business elsewhere. The garage she had tried to open on her own shut down after a year of mounting debt. Friends drifted away, cousins kept their distance, and even the family that remained rarely included her. By the time Walter's funeral came, Maya had already been living on the outskirts of everyone's world, a solitary figure with stained hands and quiet eyes. The funeral itself had been small, just a handful of relatives and a military honor guard who fired blanks into the air with stiff precision. Maya had stood at the grave, the folded flag pressed against her chest, and felt more numb than sorrowful. Her father had been distant for so long that grief felt strange, like mourning a man she never fully knew. But now, weeks later, with the lawyer's phone call, that distance shrank into something sharper. He had left her something no one else wanted, an old hangar on a decommissioned strip of land nearly 50 miles outside of town. She drove to the lawyer's office in her beat-up Chevy, the muffler rattling with every bump on the two-lane road. The man behind the desk looked at her like she was just another obligation, another file to close. He handed her a manila envelope with tax records, a map, and most striking of all, a heavy set of brass keys. They were tarnished but unmistakably military issue, engraved with serial numbers, weighted in a way that suggested purpose. He spoke with a shrug, as though dismissing the entire matter. It's not worth much. Some scrubland, a hangar that's half rust, and a whole lot of back taxes. My advice? Sell it fast before it drains you. Maya didn't answer. She turned the keys over in her hand, the metal cool against her calloused palm. They didn't feel like junk. They felt preserved, chosen. Her father hadn't left her money or a house, or even keepsakes. He had left her this. The thought gnawed at her as she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk, red and gold against the gray concrete. The world smelled of pine and wood smoke, the way it always did in October, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the old tug of memory. The mornings she and her father had sat on the porch in silence, him with coffee, her with grease still under her fingernails from the night before. Neither speaking, but both understanding that silence could be its own kind of love. She should have sold it, she told herself. She needed money more than memories. Her cousin Denise had already texted her twice. Don't be foolish. That place is worthless. Just sign it away. The voices of her family echoed in her head, each one dismissive, each one certain she had inherited nothing but trouble. But as she drove home with the keys on the passenger seat, catching glints of dying sunlight as the road wound between fields and tree lines, Maya couldn't shake the weight of them. That night she couldn't sleep. The brass keys sat on her nightstand, gleaming faintly in the dark, as though daring her to ignore them. She poured herself a whiskey she couldn't afford and stared at them until dawn. Her father had been many things, distant, strict, often unreadable, but never careless. If he had kept these keys all those years, if he had preserved them only to hand them to her at the end, then they mattered. And if they mattered to him, they had to matter to her. By morning, she had made her decision. She packed a thermos of coffee, grabbed her old mechanic's jacket, and set out on the highway that cut through miles of pine and farmland, heading toward the forgotten property her father had left her. The Chevy rattled and groaned beneath her, but it carried her forward. Fields gave way to thicker woods, the colors of fall blazing like fire. The further she drove, the more the town receded into memory, replaced by silence and the hum of tires on cracked asphalt. The road narrowed, then broke into gravel. A rusted sign leaned half-fallen by the roadside, the lettering barely visible beneath decades of weather. U.S. Air Force Auxiliary Field, decommissioned. She slowed, her heart beating faster. The air felt heavier here, almost expectant. She followed the gravel track until the trees parted and the land opened into a wide clearing. And there it was. The hangar rose before her like the curved back of some sleeping beast. Its metal skin was streaked with rust, the edges gnawed by weather, the chain-link fence around it half swallowed by vines. The concrete apron leading up to the doors was cracked and overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, useless, the way everyone had said. But to Maya, standing there with the keys clenched in her hand, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a question waiting for an answer. She killed the engine and sat for a long moment in the silence. The wind moved through the trees, sharp with the smell of earth and metal. She thought of her father, of his lined face and steady hands, of the years he had spent coming here alone, while the rest of the world forgot. What had he been doing all this time? Why guard something so carefully if it was only rust and ruin? Maya stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. She approached the massive doors, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold steel locks. The keys jingled softly, each one heavy, waiting. She slid the first into place. It resisted. She tried another. This one fit, turning with a sound that echoed in the still air like a shot. The chains rattled, groaned, then loosened. The hangar loomed, silent and imposing. Her breath caught as she gripped the metal handles. She wasn't ready, not really, but she pushed anyway. The hinges shrieked and the doors began to move. And for the first time since her father's death, Maya felt the ground beneath her shift. The hinges screamed in protest as Maya forced the hangar doors wider, and the sound carried across the empty field like an alarm no one had answered in decades. Cold air rolled out from the darkness inside, stale yet strangely clean, as though whatever lived within had been sealed away from time itself. Dust motes swirled in the sudden shaft of daylight that cut across the vast interior. And for a moment Maya stood frozen on the threshold, one hand still gripping the heavy door handle, her chest rising and falling too fast. She had come expecting nothing: rusted beams, collapsed roofing, perhaps a pile of forgotten junk, and instead she found herself staring into a cavern of shadows that did not feel abandoned at all. She stepped inside cautiously, her boots echoing on concrete so solid it surprised her. The floor wasn't cracked or buckled the way she had imagined. It was swept clean, free of leaves or animal droppings, almost too clean for a place that should have been left to rot. The beam of sunlight stretched farther, illuminating the first row of workbenches against the nearest wall. Maya blinked. Tools were laid out in perfect order: wrenches, pliers, gauges, all gleaming faintly under a thin film of dust, each one aligned as though someone had stepped away only yesterday. On the opposite wall, metal shelving units rose in neat rows, stacked with labeled boxes, the handwriting military precise. Fuel pumps, hydraulic seals, electrical harness. There was no randomness here, no scatter of abandoned projects. This was not junk. This was curated, preserved. Her heart beat harder as she walked deeper. The silence was immense, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears until it became a sound of its own. She passed a line of sealed barrels marked with faded stencils: aviation fuel. Stabilizer added, expiration meticulously recorded in her father's tight script. Her throat constricted. He had been here recently. Maybe not in the last months before his death, but certainly long enough that he had cared for these things like they mattered. And then she saw the shapes. They loomed at the far end of the hangar, massive under heavy tarps stretched tight across angular frames. At first glance, they resembled sleeping animals, hunched forms waiting for the moment to rise. One tarp had slipped slightly at a corner, revealing a glimpse of smooth metallic skin, untouched by rust. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The sight was both thrilling and terrifying, as though she had stumbled into a cathedral of machines, sacred and forbidden. She dared not touch it yet. Instead, she turned toward the smaller details, hoping for context. A corkboard hung above a workbench, pinned with faded schematics, yellowed at the edges, but preserved with careful hands. Diagrams of engines, fuselage cross-sections, component upgrades. Some sheets were stamped with military insignias. Others bore red, classified stamps that made her chest tighten. Her father hadn't just been tinkering with spare parts. He had been maintaining something official, something dangerous enough that it had been locked away and forgotten. Maya's eyes fell on a logbook open on the table. The handwriting was precise, dated meticulously across years. She scanned a few entries, her fingers trembling. Maintenance cycle completed, fuel drums inspected, avionics recalibrated. Each line described work done not by a man indulging nostalgia, but by someone fulfilling duty. Walter Rivers had kept to a schedule, as strict and disciplined as any soldier, even in isolation. The air smelled different here than outside oil and solvent, sharp and familiar, a scent that carried her back to nights spent crouched under wings with other mechanics, the roar of turbines above her, and the endless rhythm of labor that meant survival. She had thought she had left that behind. Yet here it was, stronger than memory, enveloping her in her father's world. Her gaze returned to the covered forms. She approached one, slowly, her footsteps hollow. The tarp sagged against smooth curves, hinting at wings or perhaps rotors. She reached out with a shaking hand and touched the fabric. It was stiff, military-grade canvas, the kind used to shield against weather and prying eyes. Her fingers brushed lower, against the revealed sliver of metal. It was cool and immaculate, no corrosion, no pitting, no decay. Impossible. Machines left unattended died quickly, eaten alive by moisture and neglect. This one gleamed as though it had been polished yesterday. Maya staggered back, clutching her jacket tighter around her. The hangar loomed larger now, less a building than a vault, a place where secrets had been guarded with unyielding discipline. She thought of her father again, his distant eyes, the silence that had always settled between them at the dinner table, the way he would vanish for hours or days to the airfield. How many times had she assumed he was simply hiding from the world, tinkering with broken radios or relic engines? How wrong she had been. At the edge of the room, a small frame photograph caught her attention. It was pinned above the bench, partly obscured by a folder. She picked it up. Her father stood in uniform, decades younger, his arm resting against a sleek aircraft she didn't recognize. Behind him, the background was blurred, intentionally obscured, the kind of photograph cropped for secrecy. But his face carried an expression she had never seen in life. Calm, focused, proud. Her chest ached. How little she had truly known him. The hangar doors behind her shifted slightly in the wind, groaning on their hinges, and a sliver of daylight crept further into the cavern. Dust swirled up around her boots. She realized she was trembling, caught between awe and fear. This place was not abandoned. It had been waiting. And for reasons she could barely begin to understand, it had been left to her. A vibration buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled out her phone. A message from Denise flashed across the screen. "You're not actually wasting time on Dad's junk, are you? Sell it and move on. You need money, not memories." Maya stared at the words until they blurred. She could almost hear her cousin's dismissive tone, echoing the laughter of neighbors and relatives who had written her father off as a recluse with too much scrap metal. She clenched her jaw. No one who had seen this place, who had smelled the oil, who had touched the cold, immaculate skin beneath that tarp, could call it junk. She tucked the phone away and stepped back toward the looming forms. The silence thickened, heavy as a held breath. Her father's ghost seemed to live in every corner, whispering through the order and precision he had left behind. She didn't yet know what slept beneath those covers, didn't know why he had hidden them or what it would mean for her to uncover them. But she knew one thing with certainty. Walter Rivers had not wasted his life on scrap. He had been guarding something larger than himself. As Maya stood there, the late afternoon light slid across the hangar floor, turning the tarps into shadows of giants. Her pulse quickened. She whispered into the silence, though no one could hear. "What were you hiding, Dad?" The words vanished into the air unanswered, yet the wind outside seemed to shift, rattling the loosened chains on the hangar doors like a reply. She felt suddenly, unmistakably, that she was no longer standing in a forgotten ruin. She was standing in the threshold of a secret, and secrets, she knew from her years in service, never stayed buried forever. The chill of the hangar clung to Maya long after she closed the heavy doors and returned to her truck. The silence followed her too, an echo that refused to release its grip, vibrating in the bones of her chest as she drove the long, winding road back to town. She had touched something she could not yet define, brushed against the edges of a truth her father had guarded with his life. That night she hardly slept, her mind restless, circling the shapes she had seen under canvas, the neat rows of tools, the photograph of Walter standing proud beside a machine that bore no name she recognized. When the morning finally came, she could not resist the pull. Before the sun had cleared the horizon, she was already back on that broken road, the brass keys heavy in her pocket, the hangar looming before her like a challenge. The second time she entered, she carried a flashlight. The beam sliced through the stillness, chasing shadows up to the rafters. Dust drifted like fog in the cold light, curling around her boots as she walked deeper toward the forms that had haunted her all night. She felt as though she were trespassing, even though the deed said otherwise, even though the keys were hers. It was as if this place still belonged to Walter, and she was only an intruder picking at the edges of his silence. The nearest tarp drew her like gravity. She paused before it, her breath visible in the crisp morning air, her hand trembling as she reached for the heavy fasteners that kept the canvas bound tight. One by one she loosened them, the metal clasps clinking softly, each sound magnified in the emptiness. With a slow pull, she dragged the tarp aside. The fabric rasped against the floor and released what it had been hiding for decades. Maya staggered back, her breath leaving her in a harsh rush. Before her stood a sleek aircraft, unlike anything she had ever seen. Its body was long and sharp, painted a matte black that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Twin engines sat close together near the fuselage, compact and powerful, their intakes gleaming as if fresh from inspection. The wings were short, designed for agility rather than distance, and the entire shape seemed built for disappearance, for slipping unseen through hostile skies. Along the nose, a faded stencil declared, XJ-42A Nighthawk, NATO ID classified. She pressed her palm against the metal. It was smooth and cold, every panel seamless, every seam sealed. No rust, no wear. It looked ready to fly that very instant. The cockpit canopy was tinted, but through the glass she could see a dense array of controls, more sophisticated than anything she had worked on in the Army. This was not a relic. This was a ghost from a program the world had forgotten, hidden away here like contraband. Her knees weakened, and she sat heavily on a nearby crate. Memories of her father rushed in, moments she had dismissed before, but now rearranged themselves into a pattern she could not ignore. The long nights he had spent at the airfield, the way he never let her follow him here, no matter how much she begged as a child, the endless hours bent over notebooks at the kitchen table, pretending to balance bills while he scribbled in his sharp, tiny script. She remembered the way his eyes darkened when neighbors called him a hoarder, how he never defended himself but never stopped coming here either. He had not been wasting time. He had been guarding this. With shaking hands, she searched the workbench. Folders lay stacked in perfect alignment, some sealed, others open. She flipped through schematics covered in red ink adjustments, corrections, modifications that bore her father's hand. There were checklists of maintenance routines carried out with military precision. Fuel filters replaced, hydraulics cycled, electronics calibrated. At the bottom of one page, she read a note scrawled in the margin, "Do not allow deterioration. Integrity critical. One day it will matter." Her throat tightened. A drawer yielded more flight logs, training manuals, even procurement receipts stamped with military supply codes. But at the very bottom, beneath layers of paper carefully hidden, she found something else. A letter addressed simply, "For Maya." Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped it. She broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed paper. Her father's handwriting, deliberate and firm, stared back at her. "My girl, if you are reading this, then my time has ended, and you have stepped into the place I once stood. I could not tell you the truth while I lived, not because I did not trust you, but because it was not mine to share until now. What rests here is not junk, not scrap, not waste. It is a piece of a dream the world turned its back on. They called it impractical, too expensive, too idealistic. But I believed, and I was not alone. This aircraft was designed to save lives, not take them. It could go where no runway existed, where no road could reach. It could bring hope when nothing else could. I was entrusted to guard it, to preserve it, in case the world ever needed it again. And now it belongs to you. You have always had my hands, my skill, but more than that, you have my heart. You see worth where others see ruin. If anyone can finish what I could not, it is you. Trust the machine. Trust yourself. Above all, remember, we are custodians, not owners." "Love always, Dad." Tears blurred her vision. She sat for a long time, clutching the letter, the sound of her own breath loud in the cavernous space. All the years she had thought him distant, detached, consumed by meaningless tinkering. How wrong she had been. He had been carrying a burden too heavy to explain. He had been preparing her, in silence, to take his place. Maya wiped her face and rose unsteadily. She walked back to the aircraft, her reflection faint in the black paint. Her father's legacy was not a pile of rusting tools. It was this machine, in the mission it represented. The world might never know what he had done, but she knew. And now, whether she wanted it or not, it was hers. She circled the jet slowly, tracing its lines with her eyes, memorizing its presence. Behind it, another tarp-covered form waited, larger, its outlines suggesting a different design. More than one. The scale of it staggered her. She realized her father had not been preserving just a prototype. He had been guarding a fleet. The weight of it pressed down on her, heavier than any wrench she had ever lifted. She was a mechanic with no job, a woman with no standing in a town that mocked her. And yet here she stood, heir to a secret program meant to change the way disaster relief could be delivered to those who needed it most. It felt impossible. and yet the aircraft gleamed in defiance of impossibility. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the vines that clung to the fence. The sound rushed through the half-open doors like a whisper of approval or warning. Maya stepped back, hugging her arms around herself. She had come here searching for the measure of her father's life, and she had found it. But in finding it, she had uncovered a new question. What was she supposed to do now? She closed the letter gently and tucked it into her jacket. As she turned to leave, her eyes swept once more across the immaculate order of the hangar. It was no ruin, no grave. It was a torch passed from one set of hands to another. When she locked the doors behind her and the chains clattered into place, she understood for the first time in years why her father's silence had always felt so heavy. Silence was not emptiness. It was guardianship. And now the silence was hers to carry. The weight of her father's letter pressed against Maya's chest as she drove away from the hangar that evening, the words still ringing in her mind, each line searing itself into her memory. He had written of trust, of guardianship, of hope carried forward into the future. But all she could feel in that moment was the overwhelming burden of what she had inherited. The countryside stretched endlessly on either side of the narrow road, shadows lengthening across fields where the last light of day clung stubbornly to the tops of the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, but nothing in the familiar landscape comforted her. It only made her feel more estranged, as though she had stepped into a different world altogether, one in which she had been chosen for a mission she had never asked to accept. By the time she reached her apartment, the doubts had begun their slow, corrosive work. She sat at her small kitchen table, the letter spread out before her, the keys to the hangar beside it, and she stared at both as if they might explain themselves. She had lived her entire life with engines and grease under her nails. She had kept helicopters in the air during sandstorms. She had fought with stripped bolts and faulty hydraulics at 2 a.m. while bombs fell somewhere far away. But nothing had prepared her for this. An aircraft hidden from history, preserved for decades, waiting for her hands to bring it back to life. She could almost hear Denise's voice mocking her. "What are you going to do? Fly it yourself. You can't even keep a job at a garage." Her phone buzzed, and there it was again, the chorus of derision. This time it was her cousin's name flashing on the screen. She let it ring once, twice before answering. Denise wasted no time. "I hope you didn't get sentimental out there today," she said, her voice sharp and practical. "That place is worthless, Maya. Sell it, get rid of the debt, use whatever money you can scrape out of it to put your life back in order. Don't repeat his mistake." Maya closed her eyes, gripping the phone tightly. The words like needles. She had no answer that wouldn't invite more scorn. She hung up without explanation and sat in the silence, the apartment walls closing in around her. They didn't know. None of them had seen what she had seen. But even knowing that, she still felt herself shrinking under the weight of their judgment. Sleep evaded her again that night. She turned in her bed, restless, haunted by images of the hangar. The sleek body of the aircraft glimmered in her mind's eye, pristine, waiting. She thought of her father's careful notes, the meticulous logs, the faith he had placed in her with words written only for her to read. But then the doubt came again, cruel and insistent. Why her? She was no one. A failed soldier, a failed mechanic, a woman living paycheck to paycheck in a town that barely tolerated her. If her father had believed in her, then he had believed in someone she didn't recognize. The next morning, she returned to the hangar with the stubbornness of someone compelled more by instinct than decision. The chains rattled as she slid the lock open, the massive doors groaning as she pushed them apart. The silence inside greeted her like a presence, heavy and watchful. She walked in slowly, the letter tucked safely in her pocket, and looked at the machine that stood uncovered now, black and sharp against the pale light seeping in from outside. It did not look back, yet it judged her all the same. She circled it, noting again the impossible preservation, the readiness in every detail. Her fingers grazed the cold metal, and the memory of her father's words rose again. Trust the machine. Trust yourself. But trust was not something she had much left of. Her own skills, once sharp, felt dulled by years of underuse. Her body bore the limp of a service injury, a constant reminder that she was not as strong as she once had been. And her life filled with failures and losses, hardly seemed like the foundation for a mission as immense as this. For days she oscillated between determination and despair. One moment she would be convinced that her father had chosen her for a reason, that all her years of training and her stubborn resilience had been preparing her for this moment. The next she would sink into the conviction that she was nothing more than a caretaker of a relic, unworthy of the legacy left behind. She could hear the laughter of neighbors who had always dismissed her as odd, the muttered judgments of men who didn't want a woman fixing their trucks, the condescension of her own family who had never truly seen her as capable of more than struggle. All those voices pressed against her until she almost believed them. One evening, after a long day spent pacing the length of the hangar without daring to start any real work, she sat against the cool wall and buried her face in her hands. Tears she hadn't intended to shed broke free, hot against her palms. She remembered the way her father had seemed absent even when he was near, how she had resented him for it, how she had wished he would simply talk to her instead of disappearing into his machines. And now she understood that he had been carrying a silence too heavy to share. But understanding did not erase the loneliness of it. It only made her realize how little she had ever been prepared for the inheritance she now faced. It might have ended there, with her surrendering to the crushing doubt, if not for the drawer she opened later that night. She had been searching through her father's notebooks again, flipping through the pages without really seeing them, when a smaller envelope fell out. Inside was a photograph of her as a child, no more than 10 years old, standing on a stool beside her father in his workshop, her face lit with the pride of holding a wrench almost too big for her hands. On the back, written in his careful script, were the words, "She will finish what I could not." The words burned through her despair like fire through dry grass. Her father had not left this to her by accident. He had believed in her, even when she had not believed in herself. His silence had not been neglect, but trust. He had known she would find this, and he had known she would wrestle with doubt, and he had left her this message to anchor her when everything else seemed uncertain. Maya pressed the photograph to her chest and drew a long, shuddering breath. For the first time since she had stepped into the hangar, the crushing weight on her shoulders shifted. It did not vanish. She still felt the enormity of what lay ahead, but it no longer felt impossible. Her father had believed she could carry it. That belief, however small, demanded she at least try. The next morning she returned to the hangar with a toolbox in hand. The doubts still circled like vultures, whispering that she would fail, that she was foolish to even attempt it. But she forced herself to push past them. She laid her tools out on the workbench, mimicking the precision her father had always shown. And for the first time in years, she felt the old rhythm stir within her, the rhythm of work, of discipline, of hands steadying themselves against the chaos of doubt. The aircraft loomed before her, silent, waiting. She ran her hands along its body, searching for panels that needed inspection, for seals that might require attention. Every bolt she touched, every surface she examined, pulled her further from despair and closer to determination. She was still afraid, terrified even, but beneath that fear was the slow ignition of resolve. By evening, she sat outside the hangar on the cracked concrete, the setting sun painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. The world felt just as uncertain as it had the day before, but she felt different. She was no longer just the woman everyone mocked, no longer just the failed mechanic or the forgotten veteran. She was her father's daughter, and his legacy now beat within her like a second heart. She looked at the hangar doors, chains gleaming faintly in the dying light, and whispered to herself words she had not spoken in years. "I won't quit. Shaktu." The wind stirred, rustling the trees, carrying the scent of pine through the clearing. And for the first time, Maya felt the silence of the place not as a burden, but as a vow. The vow she whispered to herself at sunset lingered like an echo long into the night. Maya carried it with her the next morning as she drove back down the winding gravel road toward the hangar, the toolbox on the passenger seat rattling with every bump. The air was sharp and clean, autumn settling deeper into the North Carolina hills, the world painted in gold and scarlet. Yet her attention never wavered from the looming shape that awaited her. The massive shell of corrugated steel crouched at the far end of the clearing. The hangar had become something different now. It was no longer just an inheritance, no longer just a riddle her father had left behind. It was a place where her doubt would either consume her or transform her. The doors groaned in protest as she pushed them open again, but this time she entered with purpose. The silence inside seemed less suffocating now, more like a challenge she was willing to meet. The aircraft sat under the slanting light, its matte black skin absorbing the morning glow, an artifact of a forgotten dream. She approached slowly, the photograph of herself as a child with her father still fresh in her memory, and she set the toolbox down at its side like an offering. The first hours of work were hesitant. She paced around the jet, tracing seams with her fingertips, unscrewing a panel here, tightening a fitting there. At every step, she half expected to find decay, corrosion, evidence that this machine was too far gone for her to save. But again and again, she found only proof of her father's devotion. The hydraulic lines were sealed, their casings intact. The wiring harnesses were wrapped in layers of insulation, unfrayed. Even the engine housing, when she pried it open, gleamed with the kind of cleanliness no abandoned machine should possess. Walter Rivers had kept it alive, piece by piece, year after year, his silent faith etched into every bolt. Still, the years had left their mark in subtler ways. Some connectors had stiffened with age, certain components bore the brittleness of time, and a few critical systems would demand replacement. Maya worked through each discovery with a mixture of awe and frustration, scribbling notes into a battered notebook, her handwriting quick and sharp. She cursed when a bolt refused to budge, cursed again when she sliced her hand on a jagged edge, then bound it in a rag and pressed on. Sweat gathered on her brow despite the chill of the hangar, the familiar ache in her back and shoulders reminding her that real work was never kind. Yet with every motion, every adjustment, she felt the rhythm of her old self returning, the soldier, the mechanic, the woman who had once believed she could fix anything. By the end of the first week, she had established a routine. She arrived early, the morning still wrapped in mist, and spent the day immersed in the ritual of restoration. She spoke little, even to herself, but her silence no longer carried the emptiness it once had. It carried focus. Each evening she left exhausted, her hands blistered and her body sore, but her spirit stronger. The machine was not yet alive, but it was stirring beneath her touch. It was on the third week that she realized she could not do it alone. The aircraft demanded resources she did not have, specialized parts, updated tools, expertise that extended beyond her training. Pride urged her to keep working in solitude, but pragmatism reminded her that the vow she had taken was not about her ego. It was about finishing what her father had started, and to finish it, she would need help. The first to appear was unexpected. A young man from town, wiry and awkward, had followed her out one afternoon after seeing her truck take the gravel road toward the forgotten airfield. He introduced himself as Devin, a student at the community college who had heard rumors about the old hangar all his life. He asked clumsy questions, eyes wide as he peered at the machine under the tarps, and though Maya bristled at the intrusion, she saw in his eager gaze something she could use. He returned the next day with a notebook and offered to help in any way she would allow. She set him to work cleaning tools, sweeping floors, fetching parts from shelves. His enthusiasm was clumsy but genuine, and slowly she began to trust him. Then came Raymond, an older man with hands as gnarled as the wrenches he carried. He had worked alongside Walter decades earlier, repairing farm machinery and cars in town, and when word reached him that Maya was spending her days at the airfield, he drove out to see for himself. At first, he offered only advice warnings about the dangers of working with aged fuel, reminders to double-check seals before testing hydraulics. But soon enough, he was rolling up his sleeves, his voice gruff but steady, his movements betraying the knowledge of someone who had lived his entire life among machines. Maya recognized the same patience in him that she had once seen in her father, and though she resisted at first, she eventually welcomed his presence. The circle widened still further when a retired pilot named Harris arrived. He had once flown experimental craft in his youth, and though his body now bore the stiffness of age, his eyes still carried the spark of flight. He brought with him a memory of what machines like this could do, A reminder that they were not just metal and fuel, but wings meant to lift people into the sky. He studied the aircraft with reverence, running his hand across its body as though greeting an old friend. He told Maya he would stand by when the time came to test the engines, to ensure the machine's spirit was honored with proper ritual. With each new ally, the hangar shifted in character. What had once been a tomb of silence grew into a workshop of purpose. Tools clanged, voices called out instructions, the air filled with the smell of oil and the sharp tang of metal filings. Devon scribbled notes furiously as Maya explained systems to him, her patience growing as she realized how much she enjoyed teaching. Raymond grumbled at the boy's inexperience, but showed him tricks learned from decades in the field. Harris walked the floor like a sentinel, offering stories of past flights that stirred the imagination of them all. Maya felt the change within herself too. The doubt had not vanished, but it no longer paralyzed her. Each problem became a puzzle to solve, each obstacle a test she could pass. She rediscovered the discipline that had once kept her alive in desert airstrips and storm-beaten runways. Her limp slowed her at times, but her hands never faltered. She bled, she sweated, she cursed, and still she pressed forward. The day the instruments lit for the first time was the day she understood the true weight of what she carried. She had spent hours tracing electrical lines, replacing brittle connections with fresh wiring she had salvaged, testing continuity with a steady hand. When she finally closed the circuit and flipped the master switch, the cockpit came alive in a wash of amber glow. The hum of power coursed through the fuselage, the panel lights blinking to life one by one. Devon gasped aloud. Raymond muttered a low whistle, and Harris simply nodded, his eyes shining. Maya stood rooted to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She touched the side of the aircraft and whispered, barely audible even to herself, "She's alive." The moment did not erase her doubts, but it gave them context. This was no longer about whether she was worthy. The machine itself had answered, and it demanded she continue. Her father's years of silent labor had not been in vain. His daughter had brought it back to breath, and though the road ahead remained long and treacherous, she knew she could walk it. As night fell outside and the hangar lights buzzed faintly overhead, Maya allowed herself a rare smile. The resurrection had begun. The machine was no longer just her father's legacy, it was hers. The hum of the cockpit lights lingered in Maya's memory long after the power switch had been turned off, and the hangar returned to its familiar silence. For weeks she carried that image inside her like a flame, nurturing it with every hour of labor poured into the machine. The team grew stronger, their rhythms steadier, their beliefs slowly catching up to hers. Yet for all their progress, the question of purpose remained unanswered. The aircraft was alive again. Yes, but to what end? Her father's notes had been clear enough in their insistence that the project was designed not for war, but for salvation. Still, it was difficult to imagine how such salvation could be delivered in a world that seemed content to forget both her father and his dream. The answer arrived one gray morning in late November, born on the static of a crackling radio. Maya had been hunched over the workbench with Devon, recalibrating the hydraulic systems, when Raymond came in from his truck holding a portable set. The lines in his face were deeper than usual, his voice graver. "There's trouble down south," he said, setting the radio down and turning the volume up. The hiss of static gave way to the clipped, urgent voice of a reporter describing the aftermath of a storm that had torn across coastal communities 2 nights before. Whole towns had been cut off, power lines down, bridges swept away. Relief convoys struggled to get through, but the roads were underwater and helicopters had been grounded by heavy winds. Thousands were stranded, some without medication or clean water, waiting for help that could not reach them. The room fell silent except for the voice on the radio. Maya felt her stomach tighten as the words painted pictures of desperation she knew too well from her time overseas. Families huddled in the dark, supplies dwindling, hospitals without power. She looked at the aircraft standing behind them, its black surface gleaming faintly in the dim light, and her father's words returned to her like a command. It could go where no road could reach. It could bring hope when nothing else could. She didn't announce her decision aloud. She didn't need to. It hung in the air as soon as her eyes met Harris's across the hangar. The old pilot nodded slowly, reading her thoughts, and said what no one else dared. "It's time to see if she still has wings." Preparations consumed them. The days that followed blurred into a storm of activity. Maya studied the logs again, tracing her father's meticulous notes about engine performance, fuel consumption, and emergency protocols. She read them as though they were scripture, each line carrying the weight of faith and fear. Raymond checked the fuel drums 3 times over, testing the seals, siphoning off contaminants, his gruff muttering hiding the tension in his movements. Devon fetched and carried without complaint, his youthful enthusiasm tempered now by awe at the enormity of what they were attempting. And Harris, though his hands shook when he held a pen, stood tall at Maya's side, running her through pre-flight checklists with the precision of a man who had memorized every word decades earlier. The morning of the test arrived under a sky heavy with clouds. Mist clung to the edges of the clearing, and the hangar doors loomed open like the gates of a cathedral. Maya stood in her mechanic's jacket, gloves pulled tight, the toolbox by her feet, staring at the aircraft that now demanded not just maintenance, but faith. She climbed into the cockpit slowly, her heart hammering as she lowered herself into the seat. The leather was stiff but intact, worn smooth where her father's hands must have rested during endless inspections. She adjusted the harness across her chest, her fingers trembling as they brushed the familiar array of switches and gauges. The silence in the cockpit was absolute, broken only by her breathing. She closed her eyes and saw her father in her mind's eye, standing silent in the corner of the hangar, his gaze steady, his presence patient. For the first time, she did not feel his silence as absence. She felt it as guidance. She opened her eyes and flipped the first switch. The aircraft stirred. A low whine built in the engines as power surged through the systems, the lights along the panel flickering to life one by one. The sound deepened, grew, until the very floor beneath her vibrated with energy. Devon shouted something from the ground, his words lost in the rising roar. But she saw the awe on his face, the disbelief that it was real. Raymond stood with his arms crossed, his expression grim but proud. Harris lifted one hand in salute, his lips moving silently as though in prayer. Maya gripped the throttle. The hum swelled into a roar, the engine spinning faster, the entire frame trembling with restrained power. She eased the controls forward, testing responsiveness, and the aircraft answered as though it had been waiting all these years for her touch. The ground beneath her blurred as the machine shuddered, then lifted, slowly, carefully, as if remembering how to fly. Dust and leaves swirled in furious circles across the concrete, the hangar shaking with the force of it. And then, with a final surge, the wheels left the earth. She was airborne. The sensation stole her breath. For a moment she was suspended between earth and sky, the aircraft quivering under her command, the horizon unfolding in a sweep of gray and gold. She steadied her hands, adjusted the trim, and felt the jet respond with surprising grace. It was not fighting her. It was carrying her. She banked slightly, circling the clearing, her pulse racing as the treetops passed beneath her. The test flight could have ended there, a simple proof of life. But Maya knew the truth. This was not just about flight. It was about purpose. She turned south, the nose of the jet pointing toward the storm-ravaged coast. The journey was both terrifying and exhilarating. The aircraft cut through the air with efficiency, its engines steady, its systems responsive. Maya adjusted to its rhythm quickly, her training reawakening with every maneuver. She monitored fuel carefully, keeping an eye on the gauges as the land rolled away beneath her. Rivers swollen with floodwater glimmered in the distance. Fields reduced to lakes, roads washed out and impassable. The further she flew, the clearer the devastation became. When she reached the outskirts of one of the isolated towns, the sight below tightened her chest. Houses half submerged, people gathered on rooftops waving frantically, smoke rising from a collapsed building. The roads were gone, bridges swept into the torrent. No convoy could reach them, no helicopter could land in the chaos. But she could. Maya steadied the jet, her hands moving with a precision that surprised even herself. She released the first cargo drop crates packed with medical supplies, water filters, and emergency rations that her team had loaded into the bay. The crates tumbled, parachutes blooming wide, drifting gently toward the desperate crowd below. She circled back, releasing another and then another, each one finding its target in the flooded streets or the fields beyond. From her vantage point, she saw figures running toward them, arms outstretched, relief etched into their movements. She did not wave, did not break radio silence. She was not here for recognition. She was here to deliver what no one else could. By the time her fuel reached the red, she turned back toward the hills. The aircraft responded smoothly, carrying her home with the same steady grace it had carried her outward. As the clearing came into view and the hangar rose once more like a sentinel, she felt tears burn her eyes. She guided the jet down carefully, the wheels touching the ground with a jolt that rattled her bones. The engines roared once more, then fell silent, leaving only the echo of what had been done. When she climbed out of the cockpit, Devon was the first to reach her, his face flushed with disbelief and exhilaration. Raymond clapped her on the shoulder without a word, his silence more powerful than anything he could have said. Harris simply nodded, his eyes wet, his expression that of a man who had lived long enough to see a dream reborn. Maya stood on the cracked concrete, the jet cooling behind her, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel it fully. The pride, the relief, the certainty that she had not failed her father. She had carried his legacy into the sky, and in doing so, she had proven that his faith had not been misplaced. That night, the news spread quickly, though no one could say exactly how. Photographs surfaced on social media, grainy shots of a black aircraft dropping supplies over floodwaters. Eyewitness accounts of a ghost jet delivering aid where none could reach. Some called it a miracle. Others speculated about secret military projects. Conspiracy forums lit up with wild theories. But amid the noise, the only truth that mattered was the one Maya carried in her chest. The machine had flown, and it had served its purpose. As she sat alone in the hangar hours later, the lights dim, the aircraft looming in shadow, she opened her father's letter once more. Her eyes lingered on the line. It could bring hope when nothing else could. She smiled through her exhaustion, whispering into the silence, "It did, Dad. It really did." The storm outside had passed, but within her, a new storm had only just begun. The world had seen the jet, and the world would not stop wondering. The world did not forget the sight of the black aircraft rising out of a storm and disappearing again into the clouds. For days afterward, the images spread in quiet ripples, shared in whispers and low voices, half believed and half dismissed. Photographs taken by shaken survivors, grainy, blurred, often half submerged in floodwater, made their way online, showing a dark winged shape banking low over ruined neighborhoods, releasing parachutes that carried crates into desperate hands. Eyewitnesses spoke of an angel jet, of salvation arriving from nowhere when every road was gone and every helicopter grounded. The Department of Defense issued no statement, and no official agency claimed responsibility, which only deepened the mystery. Some called it a prototype, others a billionaire's toy, others still a hoax. But for those who had received the supplies, it was not a story. It was survival. Maya followed the rumors from the corner of her father's hangar, her phone buzzing with forwarded articles and whispered questions. She read each one in silence, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the machine standing silent behind her. She felt no thrill in the speculation, no desire to step into the light and claim credit. All that mattered to her was the memory of the woman on the rooftop, barefoot and clutching a child, raising a hand in wordless gratitude as the parachutes drifted down. That was enough. But enough for her was not enough for the world. Soon knocks began to come at the hangar door. First, it was a pair of mechanics from a neighboring county who had read the online chatter and remembered the old Walter Rivers, the silent veteran who had spent years tinkering on machines no one else understood. They offered their time and their tools, not for money or recognition, but because they wanted to believe in something larger than themselves. Maya studied them with suspicion at first, but when they bent willingly to the grind of work, she felt her father's spirit settle heavier in the air, as though reminding her that no legacy was meant to be carried alone. Then came a woman in her 30s, a logistics expert who had once worked for a disaster relief NGO. She had tracked the rumors across states and stood at the threshold of the hangar with a notebook in hand, her eyes bright and determined. "If you're really doing what I think you're doing," she said simply, "then you need supply chains, not miracles." Maya let her in. Words spread quietly, intentionally, never shouted, but always carried by those who hungered for purpose. Former soldiers, students of engineering, doctors weary of bureaucratic obstacles, all found their way to the clearing in the woods, drawn by the whisper of a project that had refused to die. Each one brought with them their own story of being overlooked, dismissed, or told they had no place in the world's plans. And each one found in the cavernous hangar that there was room for them after all. The space transformed day by day. What had once been cold concrete and lonely shadows now rang with voices, the clang of tools, the steady murmur of strategy. Crates of donated equipment lined the walls. Maps were pinned to boards. Checklists grew longer and more intricate. The aircraft no longer stood shrouded in secrecy but gleamed under steady lights, its skin polished, its systems humming with readiness. It was no longer a ghost hidden from the world. It was the heart of something living. Maya worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She led the maintenance crews at dawn, ran supply drills by noon, and studied her father's notebooks by night until her eyes ached and her hands trembled. Doubt still whispered in quiet moments, but it no longer ruled her. Each time she felt its grip, she walked to the plaque she had hung on the hangar wall, a simple piece of brass she had engraved herself. To Walter Rivers. You were right to believe we could do better. She would rest her hand against it, close her eyes and remember his silence, not as distance, but as devotion. The anniversary of his death came in early spring. The morning broke cold and clear, the sky a pale wash of blue. Volunteers gathered in the hangar, their chatter subdued, their hands folded as though they understood instinctively that this day was not like the others. Maya stood at the front, her mechanic's jacket clean for once, the photograph of her and her father tucked in her pocket. She spoke few words. She was her father's daughter in that way, but they carried. She told them that this place was not built on war or glory, but on the belief that forgotten things could still save lives. She told them that every hand raised in work here was an extension of that belief. And she told them that her father had once been mocked for guarding junk, but now his so-called junk had taken flight, and no one could laugh at that. Afterward, they stood together in silence. The aircraft loomed behind them, gleaming like a sentinel, its matte black surface now proud rather than hidden. Outside, the wind moved across the clearing, rustling the grass, carrying with it the sound of something beginning. Requests began to arrive more openly after that. Small relief organizations sent letters asking for help where governments could not move fast enough. Academic institutions reached out, curious about the technology, offering expertise in exchange for the chance to study something thought impossible. Even a few quiet voices from military circles made contact, not to seize control, but to offer advice, old manuals, and the weight of experience. Maya accepted only what served the mission. This was not about building another weapon. It was about finishing the work her father had preserved through decades of silence. The work never grew easier. Engines demanded constant care. Supplies ran thin. Volunteers faltered under exhaustion. But in the hangar, failure was never final. Every setback became a challenge to be met. Every obstacle a reminder of why they were here. Maya pushed herself harder than anyone, her limp slowing her pace but never her resolve. At night she collapsed onto her cot in the corner of the office, her body aching, but her mind alight with plans. She dreamed not of war zones or failures, but of skies filled with machines like her father's. Machines that brought light to places the world had left in darkness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Carolina hills in fire, Maya stood in the open doorway of the hangar. Behind her, the volunteers were still at work, voices mingling with the clatter of tools. Before her, the sky stretched wide, endless, the horizon open and waiting. She thought of her father, of the silence he had carried, of the belief he had buried in this place for her to find. She thought of the child on the rooftop, of the way her small hand had lifted in gratitude. She thought of herself, once dismissed, once mocked, now standing here not as a failure, but as a guardian of something that mattered. She whispered into the wind, "We rebuild all of it, not just the machines, the mission." The words carried out across the clearing, into the dusk, into a world that was slowly beginning to remember. And so the hangar, once considered worthless land and rusting steel, became a beacon. Not of wealth or power, but of purpose. A place where forgotten dreams took shape again, where underdogs found belonging, where legacy became movement. It was no longer Walter Rivers' secret. It was no longer just Maya's inheritance. It was hope given form, a promise carried forward, a vow to never again let silence bury what could still save lives. For as long as storms raged and disasters cut paths across the earth, as long as people were left stranded and overlooked, the black aircraft would rise again from the clearing in the Carolina Hills. And at its helm would be a woman who had once been mocked for fixing engines in a man's world. A woman who had been told she did not belong. Now she stood as proof that inheritance was not measured in money or land, but in mission. Maya Rivers placed her wrench down that night and opened her father's flight log, writing the first words of a new chapter. She was no longer just the daughter of a silent veteran. She was the voice of his legacy, and she had chosen to make it heard. The sky was not the limit. It was the beginning. Before you go, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Our upcoming stories are even more unbelievable than this one. And if this video kept you hooked, then you'll want to click right here to watch the next episode. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming. Got a friend who loves mind-blowing true stories? Share this video with them now and let them discover it with you. The more people who join us, the bigger our community of story seekers grows.